Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Slay to Z, a tribute to the entire song catalog of one of the greatest bands of all time, Slayer. Where every episode we aim to pick, slice, and dissect all things Slayer. On this episode, we're officially dipping our toes for the first time into the classic era of Slayer's catalog with a look at Altar of Sacrifice from 1986's legendary Rain in Blood. And no, that 1986 re-recording of Aggressive Perfector that we just talked about does not count. The track was co-written by King and Hanneman, which is no surprise after a cursory listen. Hanneman's trademark tunefulness and punk-infused speed combined with King's typically but fantastically blasphemous lyrics drive this track towards its status as a mid-80s thrash standard. The track is made more interesting by the big swings in tempo and feel throughout. And while I never had the good fortune of witnessing this one live, surprisingly, I have to imagine it being a true energizer for the crowd. There's a good bit going on in a sub 3-minute package, so let's jump in. Now, can we really have a discussion about any track from Rain in Blood and not talk about the guitars? Of course not. Really, we can't even talk about Slayer, period, without talking about guitars. But Rain in Blood specifically, the tone is so quintessentially martial. Much has been said about the massive leap from 1985's Hell Awaits to Rain in Blood in 1986, and how much of that responsibility falls on the shoulders of Rick Rubin. At Rubin's suggestion, the band dramatically reduced the amount of reverb on all instruments, and while the drums were the most obvious beneficiary of this choice, it also did wonders for bringing the guitar tone to life. The guitar has such a nasty snarl that while certainly overdriven, still retains a natural musical quality. It feels as if you can actually hear the amp, and more importantly, the player's hands, rather than merely just hearing the distortion. Rubin succeeded in capturing the band's live sound by dumping the unnecessary outboard reverb added to Jeff and Kerry's already crushing raw tone that places you in the studio space with the guys as they are cutting their tracks. Hyperspeed, fiendishly heavy guitar that never sounds too removed from either the artist or the listener. Hanneman's riffs and arrangement throughout are so cleverly orchestrated that the caterwauling solos between himself and Kerry King are less jarring than they have any right to be. While Slayer had not been virtuosic up to this point when it came to guitar solos, many times there would appear to be some semblance of melody and structure. Rain in Blood completely dispatched this notion, and King and Hanneman went all in on the now stereotypical wailing soundtrack to hell leads that they would become best known for. Whether this was an intentional push or a natural development of the Slayer sound, it makes no difference, because this is when it all came together. All the necessary elements are in place to deliver the message with devastating authority and efficiency. There is not a moment wasted in Altar of Sacrifice. Every single riff is of the A+ variety, and they are joined together in the overall arrangement masterfully. And while Kerry is no slouch whenever it comes to great riffs, there's just something else about Jeff Hanneman's mastery of piecing parts together and creating these incredibly strong and catchy songs. And what I'm about to say may come across as blasphemous, especially towards the extreme margins of metal, but what gives any music staying power is melody. It's less about what notes you play, or even how fast you play them, and more about how you sequence those notes. How do they interact with each other? And then it progresses to how those larger pieces fit together to form that framework of a song. Let me try to articulate my point about the arrangement a little bit more. Something that I had never noticed before about Altar of Sacrifice until really sitting down to collect some thoughts for the show here is the actual structure of the song. So say the most common song structure goes something like intro, verse 1, chorus, verse 2, chorus, bridge, chorus, and then an outro. It's pretty standard stuff. Jeff Hanneman, and probably Kerry King to some degree, went pretty afar from this by arranging this song something closer to intro, verse 1, pre-chorus or verse 1A, depending on whatever you want to call it, because there is definitely a key change that goes up into a different riff. Then verse 2, then a chorus, then a solo, then a chorus, then a pre-bridge riff, then a bridge riff, then a solo, then a bridge riff or a bridge verse, and then a solo, and then an outro. On paper, it's pretty weird and asymmetrical, but it flows incredibly well whenever you're listening to it. Seamless, in fact. By the time Carey is playing the final wailing solo and the band is transitioning into the gradually slowing outro, you've hardly noticed how much ground or how many riffs have been covered in 2.5 minutes. For all the talk about speed and intensity and aggression and atonality and whatever else about Slayer, these guys were actually quite adept at putting together songs. That is why they stand above most on the mountain of thrash specifically, and above most on the mountain of metal generally. That is a huge part in their success and staying power for almost 40 years that they were a viable, active band. That is why whenever they started announcing these post-retirement shows, tickets were selling like crazy, because Slayer has always had the songs to back up the gimmick. Possible hot take incoming. I do not think Rain in Blood is Dave Lombardo's standout moment in his time with Slayer. Now, let's not let things get twisted or whatever. Lombardo is on fire throughout this record, but I will always take his performances on South of Heaven and Seasons in the Abyss as the absolute defining moments of his career. With that said, Altar of Sacrifice feels like a great example of typically manic Lombardo, with a dash of punk influence in that very brief but very effective intro. From here, he's absolutely racing at well over 200 BPM. Even the halftime feel of the bridge section still has quite a bit of that momentum behind it, with Lombardo just kind of always pushing or rushing that beat. Now, obviously, there will be more tracks from Rain in Blood to discover as we move on, but it's worth pointing out now, again, how much better the drums sound from Show No Mercy and Hell Awaits. The much drier production places the emphasis on speed and urgency rather than that almost kind of ritualistic, big, echoey drum production that it started to become known for. Once again, good on you, Rick Rubin, and good on you, Dave Lombardo, for having the chops to back up Rubin's producing guidance. Tom's vocal performance seems to have been in a transitional phase during the recording of Rain in Blood, which is highlighted here on Altar of Sacrifice. He still has that kind of almost bark kind of talk singing style of the first two records, but you can hear his building confidence as he starts flirting with a little bit more melody, albeit in a kind of a growly kind of way. We can very clearly hear Tom actually finding his voice with an audible development of both confidence and charisma. He's inhabiting the personas represented in the songs, be they simply the narrator or more harrowingly the main character in these dark fantasies. Also, huge credit to Tom for his speed and enunciation of some truly tongue-twisting lines like eyes dripping blood, realization of death, transforming 5 toes to 2. Hell, I can barely even say that line in simple, deliberate speech, dictating from my writing. Imagine trying to sing it with feeling. Now, try to imagine singing it clearly and with feeling, and also at 150 to 200 beats per minute. I have always had massive respect for Tom's vocal abilities, because for the majority of his career, he was finding a way to convincingly and confidently deliver vocal lines that were obviously not written by singers. For all their silly satanic fantasy, Kerry King's lyrics here are actually fun and really well written. Altar of Sacrifice does a fantastic job of painting a very descriptive picture of the journey from a ritualistic human sacrifice to an afterlife in which the protagonist is transfigured to a hellbound demon. It is truly wonderful stuff and one of King's best lyrics from not just the anti-religion but pro-hell/Satan category. And yes, although I do consider the lyrics to be a bit silly, I fully acknowledge how unnerving songs like Altar of Sacrifice probably were when they were released at the height of the American Satanic Panic. Unnerving and still rad as fuck, like most good songs about Satan and hell. Alright, let's get serious for a minute. In 1995, 15-year-old Elise Paler was murdered by 3 shithead classmates of hers who will not be named here. According to these absolute fucking morons, they were influenced partly by the lyrics to Altar of Sacrifice and Deadskin Mask to kill Paler as a sacrifice to Satan, who would then imbue them with greater skills playing in their shitty local metal band. Because that's exactly the means by which the devil needs to spread his message, your fucking amateur garbage-ass music. The 3 shitheads were convicted, and 2 of them were actually just paroled last year in 2025, while the 3rd is up for parole again this year in 2026. The victim's family attempted to sue Slayer, Rick Rubin, and the record label for their influence on the crime, but thankfully their suit was dismissed in 2001 on First Amendment grounds. As is always the case in similar crimes, it is never the music. Theirs was a crime that was committed at the tail end of the aforementioned Satanic Panic, a movement that was largely motivated by a fear of things that insular populations like Middle America evangelical Christians do not like or understand. Fun fact, we are witnessing a growing resurgence of the same ignorance and intolerance in current times. We must continue to carry the torch of art and expression forward, much like artists like Dee Snider, Frank Zappa, and even Mr. Sunshine on My Goddamn Shoulders John Denver did back in the 1980s against the likes of the PMRC. Mad respect for John Denver, by the way. Thank God I'm a Country Boy is a dope song, and I don't care what anybody says. On a much lighter note, I've always had a terribly difficult time listening to Altar of Sacrifice divorced from its Rain and Blood track listing neighbor, Jesus Saves. Slayer did a masterful job in seeking from the gradually slowing wind down of Altar into the relatively long building intro to Jesus Saves. It's one of the few moments on the album that affords the listener an opportunity to catch their breath. But I'm sure we'll revisit that whenever we get to Jesus Saves sometime in the next 7 or so years. On its own, Altar of Sacrifice is still a complete belter of a track and worthy of its spot on the much fawned over Rain and Blood record. In fact, I think it's the best song that we've discussed so far. To the top of the list it goes, ending 213's 4-episode run at the number 1 slot. The new champion of the catalog. But don't get comfortable, because there will be some pretty stiff competition coming along pretty shortly. On the next episode, we'll be dipping into 2009's World Painted Blood album with the track Americon. I gotta tell you, I haven't heard that track in a little while. This might get a little interesting. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're hearing this. If you want to drop a line to the show directly, give me a pat on the back for my efforts, correct me, or tell me why you disagree with me, I am always happy to read your messages at slaytozpod@gmail.com. That's slaytozpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and as always, remember.